Welcome back to the Politics and Media programme. Care homes for the elderly are failing residents from ethnic minorities. That's the stark conclusion of a report published by the Runnymede Trust last week. The Trust says that care homes fail to take residents' language or cultural needs into account. The situation will worsen if no action is taken, says the report. With me to discuss the issues are Christina Victor, Professor of Public Health at Brunel University, Dr Suja Shafi, Chair of the Muslim Council of Britain's Health and Medical Committee, and joining us by phone, I'm pleased to welcome Jabir Butt, Deputy Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation. Christina, how bad is this situation?
I think it's a very challenging situation. Certainly the care home sector has probably not well attuned to the needs of minority elders, be they for black and ethnic minority populations or from wider groups such as Eastern European migrants. So I think it's a real challenge. There are, of course, some specialist care homes that provide services for particular ethnic groups, but the general situation, I think, is challenging.
And Dr Shafi, do you think that when the report says that there's a series of cultural and language questions here, so is what we're looking at old people in care who literally aren't communicating with their carers effectively? It's quite a dangerous situation if that's true, isn't it?
It is. I mean, if you look at it in general, almost all public social services have to cater for the needs of the specific groups. If you then add on to think that the general care in the residential homes is not that great, add to that the problem of ethnic minority group, be it language, be it cultural, whatever. So it is really worryingly a big issue. Yeah.
Jabir, let me bring you into the discussion. What do you think might be done in the short term to alleviate the problems that the Runnymede Trust is pointing to?
John, before I get on to your question, can I just make a couple of points? I think there's a temptation when we talk about older people, particularly from minority communities, that we get very quickly drawn into a discussion about the problems they face, whereas actually what we've got to start off is saying that it's a sign of success of the process of migration and also how well we've done in coping with some of the challenges we've faced in this country. When you consider the evidence is that older people from minority communities have poorer health, yet they still seem to have a comparatively positive view of becoming older. It's really important that we don't just see it as a problem, but actually see it as a sign of success. But moving on from that, I think the report is right to point to some challenges, particularly challenges in terms of residential care. What we've known since the late 1980s is that we've got a significantly growing population of minority older people, and that is going to dramatically increase. And while some areas have responded to this positively, so places like Bradford and some of the London boroughs, as well as Birmingham and Leicester, have taken this on board and tried to develop residential care that meets these needs, it's not been the case that the mainstream has changed. So we've, as Professor Victor's pointed out, seen a lot of development in specialised services, but not the transfer of that to better practice into mainstream. And I think that's where we are at the moment, really. We need to ensure that all services are able to receive and work with all the people that they come across, not just specialist services, because in the end there'll never be enough specialist services to meet everybody's needs.
Christina, what do you think the chances are of that development taking place in the current financial environment?
Well, I would like to be optimistic about it, and I think Jabir's point is very relevant, not just for black and ethnic minority older people, but older people generally, that generic services should be able to cope with the multiple needs that older people present. But I don't see very much evidence that they're achieving that very well. Obviously, apart from the funding issue, one way we can address that is by education. So the education of nurses, of medical doctors, physiotherapists, and the whole range of professionals who deal with older people. And sadly, I feel that medical and other healthcare and social care related education, the students get insufficient education about caring for older people, and that's compounded by insufficient education about the particular needs of particular groups, of which black and ethnic minority groups are one of them. I think improving the education of professionals to deal with the range of people that they get would be a fairly cheap and easy, relatively easy thing to do. But sadly, old people are very low down on the curricula in any of these educational enterprises.
Dr. Shafi, do you think that the needs might be met, as some people suggest, if the homes group together people in terms of their ethnic background?
I think one really need to find innovative ways of dealing with issues. I think one could just add on to what's been said already, that actually you also find an increasing trend of people using these services within the ethnic minority groups, whereas in the past it wasn't. So it's a growing issue, both in terms of the care that is utilized, the services that are utilized, as well as the services that are provided. And yes.
Just to be clear, you're saying that there's a shift away from people being cared for by their families towards more use of
there's
of
probably,
care.
yes, there is a shift. How slow or rapid it is, it's difficult to quantify, but there's the tendency. And you'll see that as the generations increase. But you're probably now seeing a situation where there has been that shift change, and people are living longer, and as has been said, that the background illness or burden of illness in individuals is high. Therefore, all these factors need to be built into any services that are provided. And in doing so, if one has to group together, provide specialist care, why not? Yes, I think that would be a good way of doing it. And as the report says, it's not really looking for big structural changes, but first how you operate the processes, so that should really be able to help.
Jabir, what's your reaction to that solution, which is suggested in some areas that people should be grouped together according to their ethnic background, and this would be easier then to deal with some of the problems which exist when they're in the general kind of old age population in the care homes?
I think we've gone past that point already, John. Organisations throughout the 1990s and the early part of the noughties were doing that. They were developing specialist services, whether it was Milton House in Bradford, whether it was ASRA in Leicester, whether it was Notting Hill Housing Trust in London. They had gone down that route of trying to develop specific services for specific groups of older people, and they've been comparatively effective and continue to be effective. You can go to Croydon now, and there's Ashna House there where they are reaching out to particularly South Asian communities. So I think that's there. I think the real challenge for us now, though, is to ensure that mainstream provision is able to provide services because of the scale of change that's taking place. Dr. Shafi was right to point out about the ageing population. We're actually now facing something that minority communities perhaps have never faced before. If you compare life expectancy, say, with Pakistan, life expectancy for men in Pakistan is something like 64 years old, whereas in this country life expectancy for men is nearly 80. That's 16 years difference there. And while minority older people don't live as long as their white counterparts, it does mean that we are actually living much longer than we've done even in our countries of origin. So the challenges we're now facing are comparatively new and quite different. So I think mainstream services have to change. But I think as communities we have to start thinking again as well about what we understand to mean caring for our older populations, because it's actually a completely different environment to the ones we left when we left our countries of origin.
Let me just ask you, let's pull back a little bit and just ask a sort of prior question. Is residential care something that we should be aiming at as a model for anybody, including ethnic minorities? Because, I mean, obviously there's a very widespread variety of provision, basically depending on how much money you have available. But I know very few people who say, whoopee, mum's going into a residential home.
Yes, I think residential and nursing home care is, in many ways, for many of us, a very double-edged sword. I think the population, regardless of whether they're white or from ethnic minority backgrounds, most of us are our aspiration is to care for our older relatives at home for as long as we possibly can. But I think we have to recognise that, as Jabir was saying, people are living longer. Older people now have 3, 4, 5 different chronic diseases, which makes caring for them very problematic. So and allied to that as well, we have cultural change for everybody. Women go out to work, families are smaller. So you have these conflicting pressures for society. We have older people with a complex set of needs and a limited pool of carers. In an ideal world, I think we would want a system whereby we can help and support families to care for older people at home. But I think we have to temper that with an understanding of there are some older people who have no family. So we have an increasing number of people coming into old age who are either divorced, an increasing number coming into old age who have no children. So that's one trend. And I think the other thing we have to recognise that there is a point at which older people need specialist care that perhaps can't be provided in a community setting. So I think while we all have the aspiration to care for our parents or grandparents at home for as long as we can, at some points the burden, or perhaps burden's the wrong word, the demands on the family are just, I think, beyond what can be reasonably expected. So there will always be a place, I think, for some kind of long-term care.
Isn't it the case, Dr. Sheffield, that perhaps in an ideal world what people want to see is that their parents are sustained as having the capacity to, to have an independent life, to neither be in the family nor to be in care, but in some point of independence between that, where the services are sustained for them where they need them?
Yeah, and I think this is what individuals, the elderly, would also want. I know a number of those who actually really need the care but want to try as far as possible to be independent, and that's very important. And the services that we provide, the support that we provide, should really cater for those needs as well and be cognizant that that is what they want, and that gives them the pride. I think, yes, it is important to look at these aspects and make sure that the services are sort of relevant to what the needs are, and that's what we should be trying to do and work around on the next bit forward.
Jabir, do you think that the problem with that sort of other model of service is that it's simply that the authorities find it too expensive?
I'm not sure expense is an issue at this time. Undoubtedly, money does play a part in all of this, but I think what we're faced with is that there's a challenge in terms of whether mainstream residential care is reaching out to everyone, but equally there's a challenge within communities. There's clear evidence that there's an expectation amongst minority older people that their families will look after them, but at the same time, because of the experience of poverty as well as other forms of social change, families are finding it increasingly difficult to provide that care, and particularly provide it in the homes at the moment. But you can see quite a lot of change taking place. For example, Astra Housing Association has now not only started providing sheltered accommodation where older people from minority communities are helped to live in rented accommodation that has that extra support, that has a warden there who can then provide 24-hour support to them, to actually providing other things like extra care, which allows you to actually stay within your home and to receive support there. So I think people are beginning to change the way they think about the support they provide and make sure that it's more appropriate. But I don't think we'll ever get away from the situation where residential care isn't needed any longer, because as Professor Victor's already pointed out, some of the ailments that are associated, particularly with older people, that is people living over the age of 85, it's almost uneconomic to be able to provide that within the home. It's almost better to be able to provide that within a residential setting.
What do you think about the argument that says not all older people want to be grouped together or in a residential home with other old people? I mean, I know my mother's 87. She says, I hate being with old people. Yeah,
quite. Yeah, it's a very common narrative, but that's probably because none of us want to think we're that old. I think most of society is organised in an intergenerational way. We don't often associate with just people of our own age, apart from perhaps when we go to university. But I think it is a challenging issue, as Jabir was saying. I think it's not just economic reasons for sometimes older people having to go into care homes. I think sometimes there's an issue around the quality of care. What we can do at home is sometimes not optimal. Now, care homes aren't always the best environments, and there are plenty of things wrong with them, but in theory they can offer older people much better care than their family can do. And then, interestingly, in another project that I've been involved with, we were interviewing old people in care homes who spoke very much about how they didn't want to go into a care home because they felt they were going to lose their independence, who then, when we re-interviewed them about 6 months later, actually gave a much more positive narrative, which was that actually now they were in a care home, when their family came to visit them, they could spend time with their family, they could talk to their family, they could socialise and talk about the grandchildren. Their family weren't coming to care for them, so they could have a more normal relationship. So I think there are lots of issues to unpack about the role of care homes.
How far down the road do you think we are to having that kind of discussion? Because it seems to me that it's a relatively rare thing to have this level of serious discussion, and exactly. Also even rarer for it to penetrate as far as actual provision.
Yeah, I think we are getting there. We are working towards that, and I think both sides, if you like, the relatives are also becoming aware of this. And the realities of life are that because both children would work, and it's almost like childcare. So you need to balance the thing. The other halfway house would be actually the daycare, where day centres where they spend time with and they socialise, and at the same time they get back to work, back at home. I think that's another model that I think is probably being increasingly used, and maybe that's one of the things that needs to be put in the equation.
And perhaps, we should think of what care means for people who are still living independently in a broader sense. Perhaps what quite a lot of old people might like is that there is a cleaner or somebody who comes and does the tasks around the house which are physically too difficult for them to do at their age. But that we seem to be very far away from that level of debate or provision.
Yeah, and a lot of the services we provide, despite all the rhetorics around personalisation and assessing people and providing services that meet their needs, are still very defined by what professional groups do, so what a nurse does or what a health visitor does, rather than actually thinking, in order for this older person to stay at home, what's important to them? It may be the really important thing is keeping the garden nice. So if we got them a gardener, but it would be much more a positive experience for them. But I think we're still not very good at tailoring services to people's needs, and also changing the types of services we provide as people's needs change, either for the better or for the worse. So it is something I think we've struggled at, regardless of which ethnic group we're talking about, is actually to get services that are relevant to people, that help them, provide them with dignity at the end of their lives, and address the issues that are important to them and not important to us as service providers.
Jabir, do you think there's a kind of role here for pensioners themselves, for old people themselves, now beginning to become politically active around these things? Because one of the things that is quite marked is the unwillingness of the government to challenge some of the state provision for old people head on, because they're afraid of a kind of latent political power amongst old people. Do you think that could be extended into a kind of active participation in shaping the political agenda here?
I think there's always a role for politics, and getting more people involved in shaping their politics both locally and nationally is going to be key. The failure of this government to properly respond to the Andrew Dilnot proposals around the funding of adult social care is just the latest example of how politics has failed to properly address the experiences of older people as well as other people who require long-term support. But I think one of the things we do need to point out, John, is that we get very much caught in this debate that it's families looking after older people. the reality for minority older people, as is the case for the majority community, is that it's actually older people looking after other older people. So it's husbands and wives looking after their spouses rather than it necessarily being children looking after their parents. And what we're faced with is the situation where people who've lived very long and active lives are now having to contribute to looking after their partners in later life. And that's where I think the real worry is, in terms of the evidence is quite clear that it damages their long-term health as well. So it's something that requires more urgent action than sometimes we think.
Could I follow on?
Yeah.
Could I just follow on from that, as well as we know we have plenty of evidence from various surveys that the principal forms of care for older people are either your spouse or your children. So I guess the message is, if you're not married, get married quickly and have a few kids to look after you. But we also forget as well that older people are important within the family in terms of looking after grandchildren. So grandparents are very important in particularly in the times when childcare is so expensive, and often people cannot work flexibly enough to pick up their children from care. Older people are contributing to the families in that way by enabling the middle generation to go out to work, by taking over part of the childcare responsibilities. So that's something that we often forget in the debate. We think that older people just consume care from their family without acknowledging they provide it both to other older people and also to the younger generations.
And not only that, but I agree completely, but not only that, but also to the sort of upbringing and the education of the children as well. I think that grandparents play a very important role.
And what about the question of the National Pensions Association? Has got a powerful lobby of old people, not just being spoken about, but speaking for themselves.
Yes, I think the issue of politics and the sort of grey lobby has always been very problematic in Britain. Whilst we have things like the National Pensioners Parliament and we have a number of older people's group, I think we've never really seen the emergence of a strong and vibrant, what you might call grey lobby, like they have in the States with groups like the Grey Panthers, because I think our identity in Britain is not so much with people of our own age, but more to do with people of the same class as us, same kind of background. So just because two people are 70 doesn't mean to say they're the same. I think Jabir made that point earlier on. Older people are not all homogeneous, and I think the likelihood of all the 80-year-olds in the country coalescing around a single political issue is probably quite slim.
What do you think? Do you think there is more room for it, though, or
I think
even given that difficulty?
Yeah, I think people will respond to it. I think, yes, there is room for that. And I think while we're discussing these, it's good, but I think we shouldn't get away from the fact that the report has identified quite a number of improvements that are required, and we need to address that as well while we have this general debate.
Okay, well, we're going to have to bring the discussion to a close there. Thanks to my guests and my phone guests for joining in there. If you want to keep up with us, you can follow us on Twitter at Islam Channel CA. That's at Islam Channel Current Affairs CA, at Islam Channel CA if you want to follow us on Twitter. Otherwise, you can be back here next week for another edition of the Politics and Media programme.